Chloe Kensington was the kind of person who always got what she wanted. Born into a family dripping with wealth, she had never known a day where things didn't go her way. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and her mother was a famous socialite, often seen in glossy magazines. Growing up in such an environment made Chloe believe that rules were more like suggestions, meant for other people, not someone like her. She drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and lived life as if the world revolved around her. And to be honest, most of the time, it felt like it did. But Chloe wasn't just rich. She was also known for being ditzy and careless. Her friends called her fun because she threw wild parties and lived life on the edge. What they didn't say out loud was that she was reckless too. Whether it was skipping lines at fancy restaurants or parking her car wherever she pleased, Chloe operated under one simple rule: do whatever you want, and let someone else clean up the mess later. Unfortunately, this attitude finally caught up with her in a way no amount of money could easily fix. It all started on a sunny Saturday afternoon when Chloe decided to take her brand new sports car out for a spin. With its roaring engine and sleek design, the car was practically begging to be driven fast. So, naturally, Chloe obliged. She zoomed through quiet suburban streets, ignoring speed limits and treating traffic signals like optional guidelines. Pedestrians jumped out of her way, and other drivers honked their horns in frustration. But Chloe didn't care. To her, driving was less about getting from point A to point B and more about showing off how thrilling her life was. Things took a turn when Chloe sped into a residential neighborhood, narrowly missing a group of children playing near the curb. One mother screamed as she pulled her child back just in time. The screech of tires echoed through the street as Chloe swerved to avoid hitting a parked car, but instead, she crashed into a mailbox, sending shards of metal flying everywhere. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but the damage was done. Neighbors rushed outside to see what had happened, and within minutes, the police arrived. When questioned, Chloe brushed off the incident, insisting it was no big deal. She even offered to write a check right then and there to cover the cost of the destroyed mailbox. But this wasn't just about property damage. It was about endangering lives. The officer explained that charges would be filed, and Chloe would have to appear in court. At first, she laughed it off, thinking her family's lawyers would make the whole thing disappear before lunchtime. After all, hadn't they handled worse situations before? As days passed, reality began to sink in. This wasn't going to blow over as quickly as she'd hoped. Her parents, tired of constantly bailing her out, refused to hire top-tier attorneys this time. Instead, they told her to face the consequences of her actions. For once, Chloe found herself without a safety net. The thought of standing in front of a judge terrified her, not because she felt guilty, but because she hated the idea of being embarrassed in public. And so, with a mix of arrogance and anxiety, Chloe prepared for her day in court. She convinced herself that judges were just ordinary people who could be charmed, or intimidated, with enough confidence. Little did she know, the man sitting behind the bench would challenge everything she believed about power, privilege, and respect. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Chloe strolled into the courtroom nearly 30 minutes late. She wasn't worried about making a bad impression. In fact, she seemed almost amused by the whole situation. Dressed in an outfit that screamed, "I don't belong here," she wore oversized sunglasses perched on her head, a flashy designer dress, and sky-high heels that clicked loudly against the tiled floor. Every eye in the room turned to watch her as she strutted to her seat like she was walking down a runway instead of entering a solemn legal proceeding. Chloe didn't bother apologizing for her tardiness. Instead, she plopped herself down at the defendant's table, pulled out her phone, and started scrolling through social media as if nothing important was happening around her. The bailiff cleared his throat loudly, trying to get her attention, but Chloe simply waved him off without looking up. Her behavior sent murmurs rippling through the gallery. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances, silently agreeing that this girl clearly had no idea where she was or how serious the moment was. Finally, the door at the front of the courtroom opened, and everyone rose to their feet as Judge Marcus Thompson entered. He was a striking figure, tall, dignified, and radiating authority. Known throughout the city for his fairness and wisdom, Judge Thompson commanded respect wherever he went. His deep voice filled the room as he greeted those present, and his sharp gaze immediately zeroed in on Chloe, who was still glued to her phone. With a firm tone, he instructed her to put it away and pay attention. Reluctantly, Chloe slid her phone into her purse but rolled her eyes dramatically, leaning back in her chair with an air of boredom. It was clear she thought this entire process was beneath her. As the proceedings began, witnesses took the stand to describe the events of that chaotic Saturday afternoon. A neighbor recounted how terrified she'd been when Chloe's speeding car nearly hit her son. Another talked about the damage done to their property. Each story painted a picture of recklessness and disregard for human life. But Chloe barely blinked. She crossed her legs, twirled her hair, and occasionally let out a sarcastic laugh under her breath. At one point, Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, studying Chloe with an unreadable expression. He had seen defendants act disrespectfully before, but something about her attitude struck him differently. Perhaps it was the casual way she dismissed the suffering of others, or the smug smirk playing on her lips whenever someone mentioned consequences. Whatever it was, it became increasingly clear that Chloe had no intention of taking this seriously. When it came time for the prosecution to present evidence, photos of the damaged mailbox and skid marks on the road were displayed. There were even security camera clips showing Chloe's car zooming dangerously close to pedestrians. But rather than feeling remorseful, Chloe snickered, muttering loud enough for nearby spectators to hear, "It's just a mailbox. Big deal." This earned her more disapproving looks from the crowd, though she remained oblivious, or maybe she just didn't care. As the morning wore on, Judge Thompson listened intently, occasionally jotting notes on a pad in front of him. Despite Chloe's blatant lack of respect, he maintained his composure, exuding patience and professionalism. Still, anyone paying close attention could see a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He knew exactly what kind of person Chloe was, a privileged young woman convinced that rules didn't apply to her. But he also knew that sometimes the best lessons come not from harsh words, but from actions that force someone to confront their own behavior. By the time the lunch recess was called, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Spectators whispered among themselves, wondering how Judge Thompson would handle such a disrespectful defendant. Chloe, meanwhile, sauntered out as if she'd already won, completely unaware that the real battle was yet to come. After the lunch break, the courtroom resumed its tense atmosphere. Chloe returned wearing the same air of indifference, as though she had spent her recess sipping coffee at a trendy cafe instead of reflecting on the seriousness of her situation. She slouched in her chair, occasionally checking her reflection in a compact mirror and applying lip gloss. Meanwhile, the prosecutor prepared to present closing arguments, summarizing the evidence against her: reckless driving, endangering lives, and causing property damage. Witnesses had already recounted harrowing stories of near misses with children and shattered mailboxes, but Chloe seemed unfazed, treating it all like some minor inconvenience. When it came time for Judge Thompson to address her directly, there was a shift in the room's energy. His voice, steady and commanding, cut through the murmurs of the spectators. "Miss Kensington," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "do you understand the potential consequences of your actions that day?" Chloe blinked lazily, clearly caught off guard by being spoken to so directly. After a brief pause, she shrugged and replied, "I mean, yeah, I guess. But no one actually got hurt, right? Like I didn't hit anyone or anything super important." Her flippant response drew audible gasps from the gallery. Even the court clerk raised an eyebrow, pausing mid-note-taking to glance up at her. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto Chloe's. For the first time, she looked vaguely uncomfortable, though she quickly masked it with another dismissive shrug. "Miss Kensington," he continued, his voice now carrying a subtle edge. "You seem to think this is about property damage, a mailbox, a fence, a dent in someone's car. But let me ask you something. What if those children playing outside hadn't been pulled away in time? What if your speeding resulted in a tragedy that could never be undone?" Chloe opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. She wasn't used to people challenging her so directly, especially not authority figures who were supposed to bow to her family's influence. When she finally spoke, her words dripped with arrogance. "Look, accidents happen. Okay. It's not like I plan to almost hit anyone. And besides, I can totally pay for whatever I broke. Problem solved." Her comment ignited a wave of murmurs throughout the courtroom. People exchanged glances, shaking their heads in disbelief at her blatant disregard for human life. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, averting his eyes from the spectacle unfolding before him. Judge Thompson, however, remained composed. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as he studied her carefully. Then, in a calm yet cutting tone, he said, "You speak as though money can repair everything, as if writing a check absolves you of responsibility. But tell me, Miss Kensington, how much would you charge to bring back a child lost because of recklessness like yours, or to undo the trauma endured by families who live in fear every time they step outside due to drivers like you?" For a split second, Chloe faltered. The weight of his words seemed to register somewhere deep within her, though she quickly masked it with defiance. Rolling her eyes dramatically, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Whatever. This is ridiculous." That was the final straw. Judge Thompson sat up straighter, his expression hardening. "Miss Kensington," he said sharply, "this court operates on principles of justice and respect. For the law, for others, and for the gravity of your actions. You will show proper decorum here, or we will take steps to ensure you do." The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chloe, realizing she might have pushed too far, forced herself to sit still, though her jaw tightened in irritation. For the first time since the trial began, she stopped fidgeting with her phone or fixing her hair. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at the judge with thinly veiled contempt. But Judge Thompson wasn't finished. Leaning forward once more, he added, "Your privilege may shield you from many things, Miss Kensington, but it does not exempt you from accountability. Today, you'll learn that lesson, one way or another." With that, he called for a brief recess, leaving Chloe stewing in her seat while whispers filled the room around her. Though she tried to maintain her confident facade, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, a sign that perhaps, just maybe, she was starting to realize the gravity of the situation she'd landed herself in. When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Thompson wasted no time in delivering a powerful message. He began by addressing Chloe directly, his voice calm but firm, carrying an undeniable authority that silenced even the faintest rustle in the room. "Miss Kensington," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you seem to believe that wealth and status are shields capable of deflecting accountability. But let me remind you of something. Justice is blind to privilege." Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier bravado beginning to crack under the weight of his words. For once, she wasn't checking her reflection or sneaking glances at her phone. Judge Thompson continued, his tone measured but laced with emotion as he recounted stories from his own experiences on the bench. Stories of families torn apart by reckless drivers like her. "There was a young boy named Marcus," he began, pausing briefly to let the name sink in. "He was only 8 years old when a speeding car jumped the curb outside his school. His mother had just dropped him off for class. She watched helplessly as he was struck down before her eyes. That driver walked away without so much as a scratch. But Marcus didn't. He spent months in the hospital, enduring surgeries and physical therapy. And even now, years later, he still struggles with injuries that will affect him for the rest of his life." The courtroom was eerily silent, every person hanging on to Judge Thompson's every word. Chloe's face remained blank, though a flicker of discomfort passed over her features. The judge pressed on, his voice unwavering. And then there's Mrs. Daniels, a grandmother who lost both legs after being hit by a drunk driver while crossing the street to visit her grandchildren. Her story isn't unique. It's tragically common. Every year, countless lives are destroyed because someone decided their convenience mattered more than the safety of others. As he spoke, Chloe's usual smirk faded completely. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on her. Some stared in judgment, others in pity, but none carried the admiration or envy she was accustomed to seeing. It was clear that Judge Thompson wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking for those who couldn't be there to tell their own stories. But it goes deeper than that, Judge Thompson added, his gaze locking onto hers. Reckless behavior like yours doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you choose to speed through neighborhoods, endangering innocent people, you're perpetuating a cycle of harm that affects everyone, not just those directly involved. Families suffer, communities grieve, and yet individuals like you rarely stop to consider the ripple effects of your actions. At this point, Chloe shifted again, her polished nails tapping nervously against the table. She tried to mask her unease by rolling her eyes one last time, muttering sarcastically, "Yeah, okay, I get it. People make mistakes." Her comment hung awkwardly in the air, met with shocked silence from the spectators. Judge Thompson's expression hardened. "No, Miss Kensington, what you fail to understand is that mistakes have consequences. Real ones, painful ones. And until you acknowledge that, you'll continue down this path of entitlement, leaving destruction in your wake without ever taking responsibility." For the first time, Chloe seemed genuinely unsettled. Though she tried to maintain her indifferent facade, small signs betrayed her growing discomfort. Her fidgeting hands, her darting eyes, the way she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Judge Thompson noticed too, but instead of softening his approach, he leaned further into the lesson. "Today," he concluded, "you're going to learn that true accountability isn't about writing a check or offering a half-hearted apology. It's about understanding the impact of your choices and making amends in a way that fosters real change. Because if you don't, you'll remain exactly where you are now, blind to the world beyond your own desires." With that, Judge Thompson sat back, signaling the end of his monologue. The courtroom remained silent for several moments, the gravity of his words settling over everyone present, including Chloe. Though she still clung to fragments of her arrogance, it was evident that something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she found herself questioning whether her privileged bubble might actually be more fragile than she'd ever imagined. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Thompson prepared to deliver his verdict. Everyone leaned forward slightly, their curiosity piqued. What would he decide for someone like Chloe Kensington, someone who had shown nothing but disdain for the law and those affected by her actions? The anticipation hung thick in the air, and even Chloe seemed momentarily frozen, her usual bravado replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses and spoke in a clear, deliberate tone. "Miss Kensington," he began, "it's evident that traditional penalties, fines, or jail time would mean little to someone in your position. You've grown accustomed to using money as a solution, brushing off consequences without truly understanding them. Therefore, I have decided on an alternative sentence, one designed not only to hold you accountable, but also to teach you empathy." Chloe blinked, caught off guard. Empathy. She wasn't sure she'd ever heard that word applied to her before. Her lips parted as if to protest, but Judge Thompson raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "For the next month," he continued, "you will dedicate yourself full-time to volunteering at the Lincoln Community Center, a facility serving families impacted by reckless driving incidents. Your duties will include assisting victims, organizing support groups, and helping with day-to-day operations. Furthermore, you are required to personally write letters of apology to each individual harmed by your actions, not generic apologies, but sincere reflections on what you've learned from this experience." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged surprised glances. This wasn't the kind of punishment people expected to hear in a courtroom. Chloe, however, looked horrified. Volunteering. Writing letters. To her, it was unthinkable. And one more thing, Judge Thompson added, his voice firm. You must attend weekly ethics classes conducted by community leaders. These sessions will focus on personal responsibility, accountability, and the importance of respecting laws, not just for your sake, but for the well-being of society as a whole. Failure to comply with any part of this sentence will result in immediate incarceration. Chloe's jaw dropped. For the first time since the trial began, she couldn't find words to respond. Her mind raced with objections, excuses, and plans to wriggle out of this absurd arrangement. But Judge Thompson wasn't finished yet. I want to make something very clear, he said, fixing her with a piercing gaze. This isn't about punishing you. It's about teaching you. If you approach this opportunity with sincerity, you may discover things about yourself and the world that you've never considered before. But if you treat it as another chore to check off your list, you'll gain nothing. And trust me, Miss Kensington, gaining nothing is far worse than facing a fine or jail time. With that, he banged his gavel, officially concluding the hearing. The courtroom buzzed with chatter as people filed out, many discussing the unusual sentence. Some admired Judge Thompson's creativity, while others doubted whether someone like Chloe could truly change. As for Chloe herself, she sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the bench where the judge had been moments ago. Her lawyer approached cautiously, offering reassurance. We can appeal this decision, Chloe. There are options. But Chloe barely heard him. Her thoughts were consumed by dread. A month working in a low-income neighborhood, interacting with strangers whose lives had been shattered by accidents like hers. The idea felt unbearable. Yet deep down, buried beneath layers of arrogance and privilege, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout. Was it possible that Judge Thompson was right? Could this strange sentence actually teach her something? As she finally rose from her seat and walked out of the courtroom, Chloe's steps were slow and heavy. Cameras flashed outside, reporters shouting questions she ignored. For once, she didn't care about appearances or how she looked in front of others. All she could think about was the daunting task ahead, and the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, she deserved every bit of it. The first day of Chloe's sentence arrived, and she showed up at the Lincoln Community Center wearing dark sunglasses, a designer tracksuit, and an attitude that screamed reluctance. She parked her car haphazardly in front of the building, drawing annoyed glances from staff members who were already busy setting up for the morning. Clutching the court-mandated volunteer schedule like it was a subpoena, she strutted inside, clearly uninterested in being there. Ms. Harper, the center's director, greeted her with a warm but firm smile. "Welcome, Miss Kensington," she said, extending her hand. Chloe hesitated before shaking it, her expression dripping with disdain. Ms. Harper didn't seem fazed. She'd dealt with difficult personalities before. "We're glad to have you here," she added, though her tone hinted that glad might be stretching the truth. "Let's get started." Chloe was assigned to assist in the child care area, where kids whose parents attended support groups played under supervision. At first, she treated the task like a punishment, sitting stiffly on a plastic chair while scrolling through her phone instead of engaging with the children. When one little boy tugged at her sleeve, asking if she wanted to build blocks with him, she waved him off without looking up. "Not now, kid," she muttered, earning a disapproving glance from another volunteer nearby. Over the next few days, Chloe continued to go through the motions, doing the bare minimum to avoid trouble. She half-heartedly helped organize supplies, avoided eye contact with anyone who tried to talk to her, and complained loudly about how unfair the whole situation was. During breaks, she called her friends, venting about the dumpster fire of her life. "These people act like I murdered someone," she whined into her phone. It was just a mailbox. But despite her resistance, small moments began to chip away at her defenses. One afternoon, While reluctantly serving snacks to a group of children, Chloe overheard a young girl talking about her father. "He doesn't walk anymore," the girl said matter-of-factly to her friend. "A car hit him last year." Chloe froze mid-pour, the pitcher of juice hovering awkwardly above a cup. She glanced at the girl, noticing the innocence in her voice and the sadness behind her words. For the first time, Chloe felt a pang of guilt, though she quickly pushed it aside. Later that week, Chloe was asked to sit in on a support group meeting for families affected by reckless driving. Reluctantly, she took a seat in the back corner, arms crossed tightly across her chest. As the session began, a woman named Maria stood up to share her story. Her voice trembled as she described losing her teenage son to a hit-and-run driver 2 years earlier. "He was coming home from football practice," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And now he's gone. Forever." Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unable to look away. The raw emotion in the room was overwhelming, and for once, she couldn't hide behind sarcasm or indifference. Another man spoke next, recounting how his wife had been left paralyzed after a speeding driver ran a red light. Each story painted a vivid picture of lives shattered by carelessness, lives not so different from those Chloe had endangered. By the end of the meeting, Chloe's usual smirk was gone. She walked out silently, avoiding eye contact with anyone. That night, alone in her luxurious apartment, she stared at the blank page where she was supposed to write her first apology letter. Her pen hovered uncertainly over the paper, but no words came. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about the people she'd hurt, even if unintentionally. As the days turned into weeks, Chloe's attitude slowly began to shift. She started showing up on time, putting her phone away during shifts, and actually interacting with the people around her. She still struggled with humility, often reverting to old habits when frustrated, but tiny cracks were forming in her armor. One morning, while playing catch with a shy boy named Ethan, she found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in ages. It was a small moment, but it stuck with her. Though Chloe was far from fully transformed, these experiences planted seeds of change. For the first time in her privileged life, she began to see the world beyond her own reflection. And it wasn't pretty, but maybe, just maybe, it could teach her something worth learning. By the third week of her sentence, Chloe began to notice subtle shifts in herself, changes she couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either. At first, it was small things. She stopped rolling her eyes when someone shared a painful story, started asking questions instead of tuning out during support group meetings, and even offered genuine smiles to the kids at the community center. These moments felt foreign to her, almost like she was stepping into a new version of herself without fully realizing it. One afternoon, while helping organize supplies for an upcoming event, Chloe found herself working alongside Maria, the same woman who had spoken about losing her teenage son to a reckless driver. Up until that point, Chloe had avoided any meaningful interaction with her, too ashamed to face the pain she represented. But this time, something inside her pushed her to speak up. "Maria," she said hesitantly, her voice quieter than usual, "can I ask you something?" Maria looked up, surprised by the unexpected question. "Sure," she replied cautiously. Chloe fidgeted with a stack of flyers before blurting out, How do you keep going after something like that? I mean, losing someone so suddenly. It must feel impossible." Maria studied her for a moment, then sighed deeply. "It's not easy," she admitted. "Some days are harder than others. But I focus on what he loved, his laugh, his kindness, the way he lit up a room. And now, I try to honor him by helping other families who've gone through similar losses." Her words hit Chloe like a punch to the chest. For the first time, she saw grief not as something distant or abstract, but as a living, breathing weight carried by real people. It wasn't just about statistics or headlines. It was about shattered dreams, empty chairs at dinner tables, and holes in hearts that could never be filled. The realization made her stomach churn with guilt and determination. Over the next few days, Chloe threw herself more fully into her volunteer work. She helped plan a fundraising event for victims' families, stayed late to clean up after activities, and even initiated conversations with people she previously dismissed. One evening, she sat down with Ethan, the shy boy she played catch with earlier, and asked him about his favorite hobbies. To her surprise, he opened up eagerly, talking excitedly about his love for drawing superheroes. By the end of their chat, he gave her a crayon sketch of a caped figure labeled Miss Chloe. It was lopsided and messy, but it brought tears to her eyes. As the final week approached, Chloe tackled the task she'd been dreading most, writing her apology letters. Sitting at her kitchen table one night, she stared at the blank pages spread out before her. Each letter required thought and sincerity, two things she wasn't used to giving. But as she reflected on everything she'd witnessed and experienced over the past month, the words began to flow. To Mrs. Daniels, she wrote in one letter, "I am truly sorry for the pain my actions caused. Until recently, I didn't understand the lasting impact of reckless behavior, but hearing your story changed that. Thank you for sharing your strength with me." In another, addressed to Maria, she penned, "Losing your son must have broken your heart in ways I can't imagine. I hope someday you'll believe me when I say I regret putting others in harm's way. You inspire me to do better." Each letter took hours to craft, but by the end, Chloe felt lighter, as if she were shedding some of the weight she'd carried since the trial. When she handed them to Judge Thompson during her follow-up hearing, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I meant every word," she told him earnestly. Judge Thompson nodded, his expression softer than before. "Apologies are only the beginning, Miss Kensington," he reminded her. "The real test is whether you continue to live differently moving forward." Chloe left the courtroom that day feeling uneasy yet hopeful. She knew she wasn't perfect, far from it. But for the first time, she wanted to be better. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start building a new life, one built on humility, empathy, and purpose. The final hearing arrived, and Chloe stood before Judge Thompson once again. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the arrogance, the dismissive smirk, and the air of entitlement that had defined her earlier appearances. Instead, she walked into the courtroom with quiet determination, dressed simply in a modest blouse and slacks. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, but there was no swagger in her step, only purpose. When called to speak, Chloe stepped forward, holding a folder containing the letters she'd written to those affected by her actions. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. For a moment, she glanced at Judge Thompson, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then, turning to face the gallery where some of the victims' families sat, she began to read aloud. "To Mrs. Daniels," she started, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I want to apologize for endangering lives that day, including yours. Hearing your story made me realize how reckless my behavior truly was. I regret putting you and others through fear and pain, and I promise to never let something like this happen again." She paused, looking directly at Maria, whose son's tragic death had left such a profound impact on her. "Maria," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "losing your son must have been unimaginable. I can't begin to understand the depth of your loss, but I hope you know that I'm deeply sorry for contributing to the kind of harm that took him away from you. You've taught me so much about resilience and love, and I'll carry those lessons with me forever." As Chloe spoke, tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She read each letter with sincerity, addressing not just the individuals harmed by her actions, but also acknowledging the broader consequences of her recklessness. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the occasional sniffle from spectators moved by her words. Judge Thompson watched her closely throughout, his expression unreadable until she finally lowered the folder and returned to her seat. After a brief pause, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Miss Kensington," he began, his tone measured yet warm, "what I've seen today is a marked change in your attitude. Your apologies seemed genuine, and your efforts over the past month demonstrate a willingness to learn and grow. That's commendable." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But remember, redemption isn't earned in a single moment or act. It's a lifelong commitment to doing better, to treating people with respect, taking responsibility for your actions, and using your privilege to uplift others rather than dismiss them. The road ahead won't always be easy, but if you continue down this path, I believe you'll find meaning beyond anything material wealth can offer." Chloe nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed firmly on the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly. "I know I still have a lot to learn, but I promise to keep trying. To be better, not just for myself, but for everyone else too." With that, Judge Thompson announced the conclusion of her sentence, officially closing the case. As Chloe exited the courtroom, she felt lighter than she had in months. Outside, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and curious onlookers whispered among themselves. But instead of ignoring them or brushing them off, Chloe stopped briefly to address the crowd. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice clear and strong. "And while I can't undo what happened, I'm committed to making things right moving forward. Thank you to everyone who helped me see the bigger picture. It's changed my life forever." Her statement sent ripples through social media, sparking conversations about accountability and second chances. Some praised her transformation. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether true change could last. But Chloe didn't care about the opinions anymore. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be perfect, but for the first time, she felt grounded, ready to use her experiences to help others and advocate for safer roads. In the weeks that followed, Chloe kept her promise. She continued volunteering at the community center, organized awareness campaigns about reckless driving, and even partnered with local schools to teach teens about road safety. Slowly but surely, she transformed from the spoiled heiress who thought rules didn't apply to her into someone determined to make a difference. And though Judge Thompson never said it outright, he watched her progress with quiet pride, knowing that justice had served its highest purpose, not just punishing wrongdoing, but inspiring growth.